faithfully delivering value, interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today we're exploring the book Forgiveness. Forgiveness? For ordinary folks like us, it's actually not hard to grasp it all. We might say, I forgive daily, whether it's my unreasonable child or that rude stranger who snapped at me. Yes, the forgiveness we know best is just like the dictionary says, pardon and absolution. But in this book by Desmond and Mfo Tutu, forgiveness carries far deeper, weightier meaning. Forgiveness not only enabled South Africa's national reconciliation, but laid the groundwork for its current stability. And that is the following. Why do I say that? To grasp what forgiveness meant to the authors and South Africans, we must first understand apartheid history. In 1948, the all-white National Party, dominated by Dutch-descended Boers, took power and ruthlessly enforced apartheid. Under these brutal policies, South Africa's non-white majority, especially Black people, faced cruel exploitation and injustice. The government bulldozed Black townships, forcing generations of residents into settlements resembling dumps, just matchbox houses, overcrowded and suffocating.
Worse still, schools, recreation, and jobs were severely restricted, and interracial marriage strictly forbidden.
Under this system, Black movement was shackled. Blacks over 16 had to carry passbooks. Forget yours and you'd be handcuffed. Shoved into army trucks for interrogation, enduring white police barging in at midnight for pass checks. Under apartheid, Blacks were third-class citizens. However, where there's oppression, resistance follows. In 1960, peaceful protests against pass laws sparked the Sharpeville Massacre. In 1976, Black students protest making Afrikaans the language of white oppressors, the teaching language, igniting the Soweto uprising. Apartheid and endless violence sank South Africa into economic decline and global isolation. Only under mounting pressure did the government finally dismantle apartheid laws. In 1994, South Africa held its first multiracial election, with Nelson Mandela becoming its first Black president, finally freeing Black South Africans from their suffering. In 1997, South Africa's permanent constitution took effect, thus formally ending over 50 years of apartheid. As a Black man, oppressed most of his life, author Desmond Tutu dedicated himself to nonviolent struggles for equality. For this, he received the 1984 Nobel Peace Prize. In 1985, he became South Africa's first Black Archbishop. In 1995, President Mandela personally appointed him chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, tasking him with comprehensive investigations. This covered severe human rights violations in South Africa from 1960 to 1994, providing victim support and restoring dignity. Critically, to prevent endless revenge cycles and economic collapse, Mandela's government considered amnesty for perpetrators who confessed. Through the expectations, Tutu guided countless traumatized Black people away from vengeance onto forgiveness. This path led multitudes from darkness into renewed lives. Through South Africa's history and his own journey, Tutu shows us only forgiveness heals deep wounds. Here, wounds means profound traumas people endure. Co-author Mfo Tutu, Desmond's daughter, is an experienced priest, teacher, and writer. As CEO of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation, she continues sowing seeds of forgiveness and peace across South Africa. So what power enables forgiveness to reconcile enemies and rebirth a suffering nation? Let's explore in two parts. The secrets of forgiveness. First, why forgive? Second, how to forgive. Though Tutu's forgiveness stabilized South Africa, for ordinary people, forgiving those who caused deep harm or lost humanity in war feels nearly impossible emotionally. So, why should we forgive? Let's see what Tutu has to say. First, Tutu believes that only forgiveness can stop people from falling into a cycle of revenge. In other words, whether for nations or individuals, without forgiveness, there's no future. Our primitive ancestors, when facing threats in nature, instinctively fought back. So, revenge is kind of ingrained in our genes. Although revenge is a primal instinct, modern reason tells us that if we choose revenge after suffering violence, we become the next perpetrator. If the other side keeps retaliating, revenge becomes an endless loop. This way, all our future time gets wasted preparing for revenge and bracing for retaliation. How can we talk about a happy life if after suffering violence, we choose the path of forgiveness? The violence stops here. We don't get stuck in an endless revenge cycle, but break free and move forward into a new life. It was precisely because Mandela and Archbishop Tutu deeply understood the danger of a revenge cycle between blacks and whites, fearing the fragile new South Africa might collapse, that they strengthened cultural and psychological rebuilding after apartheid ended, guiding collective forgiveness through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to steer South Africa towards stability. Secondly, Tutu believes forgiveness brings true freedom. Many might think forgiving enemies is just letting them off too easy. But Tutu argues forgiveness has nothing to do with others. It's purely your own decision. Here we can reference the famous psychologist Adler's theory of separation of tasks. That means we need to distinguish between our own tasks and others' tasks, our own business and others' business. If you refuse to forgive, drowning in resentment towards someone, thinking your hatred punishes the perpetrator, actually, you're wrong. The torment of resentment you suffer, the perpetrator might not even know or care, because whether you hate or not is solely your own task, unrelated to others. Forgiveness is just your choice and won't change the perpetrator's situation. So, forgiveness is you freeing yourself, stepping out of resentment's cage to regain freedom. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, never a reward for the perpetrator. Notably, forgiveness doesn't mean abandoning justice. Those who break laws and moral codes still face legal punishment. But what punishment does the perpetrator receive? Or how the perpetrator fares after being forgiven, that's his own business. You don't need to be responsible for others. Just focus on your own responsibilities and strive to live better. Tutu made countless traumatized Black South Africans realize that forgiveness isn't for the perpetrator's sake, but for their own well-being, ultimately enabling national reconciliation. Finally, Tutu believes we forgive because everyone shares similar humanity. Why do I say that? Before that, let's hear a Bible story. A woman caught in adultery was brought by the Pharisees to the crowd. They told Jesus, "Mosaic law says such a woman should be stoned to death. What do you think?" After long thought, Jesus said, "Let anyone without sin cast the first stone at her." In the end, the people all silently dispersed, because after hearing Jesus' words, they realized we all share similar humanity. No one dared claim they were sinless and perfect. Yes, we're sometimes generous, other times selfish, sometimes kind, other times malicious, sometimes thoughtful, other times reckless. Everyone is equally complex, and everyone has likely done bad things. The worst thing a person has done doesn't define their essence. Even we ourselves could become cruel and violent under certain circumstances, hurting others. And Tutu wrote that if he'd been born into the white ruling class during apartheid, he might have easily done those things that belittled and harmed Black people. When we see each other's shared humanity, it's easier to find compassion and empathy for others' weaknesses and atrocities. Once we find that compassion and empathy, we can move toward forgiveness. Now, perhaps you've understood what forgiveness means for yourself. But whenever you think of the person who brought you suffering and torment, it feels agonizing and you don't know how to forgive. Now let me first answer the most common confusion: how to forgive others. As the chair of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Archbishop Tutu, to help South Africans achieve national unity by uncovering the truth of the past. From 1994 to 2003, he heard testimonies from 21,000 witnesses about human rights violations. Among them were perpetrators of the apartheid system and those who enforced racial discrimination and apartheid policies.
Oh.
He witnessed countless people who could have chosen violence and revenge, but instead took the path of forgiveness. Through repeated practice, Tutu summarized a 4-step process for forgiving others: speak it out, acknowledge inner feelings, grant forgiveness, and rebuild or let go of the relationship. Now let's see how to do it specifically. The first step in forgiving others is to speak it out. Perhaps everyone wonders, why should we speak out facts we don't want to mention again? Yes, perhaps no one wants to revisit that pain and humiliation. But if you lock hurtful secrets inside, you'll keep living under the torment of a victim complex, suffering alone. Over time, your personality and how you view the world will drastically change. To illustrate the consequences of not speaking out, the author gives this example in the book. Jeffrey, 30 years old, looks dignified and tall, but whenever he recalls that childhood experience, he reverts to a helpless little boy. At age 12, he was sexually abused by his teacher and coach, but he never dared tell his mom, because as a child, he always felt he'd done something wrong to cause the teacher to treat him that way, enduring pain beyond his years, alone. After entering adolescence, Jeffrey's personality gradually became irritable, and he distrusted anyone, especially adults. Until age 30, that year, encouraged by his girlfriend, he finally spoke about the experience for the first time. He said speaking out made him feel a huge weight off his shoulders. His life from age 12 until now felt like barely surviving in a cellar. When you decide to speak it out, you might immediately face a big problem. Whom to tell? If you can't find a suitable person to talk to, you might end up like Jeffrey, forced to bury the secret deep inside. The author offers 3 choices. First, you can find someone you absolutely trust to talk to. This person could be your family, close friend, a trusted elder, or a psychologist. As long as this person has empathy and makes you feel completely safe, it's fine. Second, you can choose to speak publicly. Public doesn't mean you can't be anonymous. You can totally share on story sharing websites or forums where people share life stories anonymously to talk about your hurt. Finally, you can also choose to speak directly to the perpetrator. This is actually the best way. When you bravely tell the perpetrator the fact of how you were hurt, you're reclaiming your dignity. However, doing this is a bit risky because you're not sure if the perpetrator feels remorse and is willing to listen. So only when that person has expressed sincere remorse to you can you choose this method. Once you've found a suitable listener, how do we tell our story? Perhaps because it was long ago, your memories are fragmented. Then try to piece the memory puzzle together and just state the facts as much as possible. Only when you've basically restored the facts can you enter the second stage of forgiving others. Acknowledge the inner pain. Facing the pain, many people choose to escape, suppress their feelings, or tell themselves they shouldn't have those uncomfortable feelings. This approach seems simple and safe. In fact, when you bury painful feelings deep inside, they start to fester internally, and one day, they burst open like a boil. As mentioned earlier, Jeffrey couldn't acknowledge his inner pain, and the result was that he almost lost 18 years of a normal life. Divorce? Courts, through numerous divorce cases, have also proven this fact. If one spouse is used to suppressing emotions, or if the hurt from one spouse is never acknowledged, then the marriage is more likely to break down. So, if you're used to ignoring inner pain, one day it will consume you. So, what does it mean to truly acknowledge inner pain? The author believes that to acknowledge pain, one must go through 3 stages: mourning, regret, and acceptance. You can mourn not only the loss of a person, but also the loss of a beloved possession. Mourning a relationship or a hope means allowing yourself to feel the pain of that loss. At this stage, we're likely to experience emotions like denial, anger, and melancholy. For example, if the Jeffrey mentioned earlier acknowledged his pain and went through mourning, he might be denying the facts one moment, unable to believe that the teacher he once respected could lose his humanity like a beast.
The next moment, he might be furious, angry that the teacher dared to do such things to him.
Then perhaps he sinks into melancholy again.
Such emotional fluctuations are actually normal in the mourning process. The next stage of mourning is regret, meaning wishing things had been different. For instance, if I hadn't chosen him as my husband back then, I wouldn't be suffering so much now. If I hadn't taken that road, I might not have been assaulted. Through repeated what-ifs, we affirm our present pain, vulnerability, or failure. But regret doesn't give us strength. Regret needs moderation, and acceptance is the only way to truly face our inner pain. Acceptance means admitting, whether you like it or not, that the situation is settled and can never be undone. Acceptance means seeing the truth clearly and acknowledging your own fragility, fear, anger, and pain. In other words, it's about admitting defeat, recognizing that you too have weaknesses and helplessness. You're not an invincible survivor. This despair after deep reflection will ultimately strengthen your resilience in facing pressure. Now that we've spoken it out and acknowledged our inner pain, then we should enter the third stage of forgiving others, granting forgiveness. How can we take that difficult first step? The author believes the most important point is to remind yourself that you and the perpetrator share similar humanity. After recognizing your shared humanity, you can also examine the perpetrator's backstory. For example, the teacher who abused young Jeffrey might have been a victim of domestic violence himself. The thief who broke into your home might be facing severe financial hardship due to his mother's serious illness. Of course, these stories aren't excuses for the perpetrator. They just give you another reason to forgive. We can also say that if acknowledging your inner pain means accepting your own human weaknesses, then granting forgiveness is trying to accept the perpetrator's human weaknesses. So, what does it mean to forgive sincerely? Forgiveness feels different for everyone. For some, it's like lifting a heavy burden. For others, inner peace. Simply put, when you can bless instead of curse someone you once hated, you've truly forgiven them. However, granting forgiveness isn't the end of the process. After forgiving the person who hurt you, you still need to complete the final step, choosing to rebuild or release the relationship. Only then will you know how to face those who hurt you and find true inner peace. Here, rebuilding doesn't mean restoring the relationship to its original state, but creating something new after the hurt. Rebuilding happens more easily with close relationships, parents, spouses, siblings, or dear friends. Because you share strong emotional bonds with them, they're not easily severed. So how do you rebuild? First, ask yourself what you need. Maybe you want an apology from your abusive father. Maybe you hope your ex-husband who betrayed you expresses remorse. When you bravely voice your needs to the perpetrator, you transform from victim-perpetrator dynamics into a new relationship. You might share a meal again with your silver-haired father. You might stop obsessing over your ex's social media and become casual friends. Rebuilding is like disassembling a Lego castle crushed by a child and creating new shapes. Imperfect, but whole. It becomes sturdy again. But if you get no response, or if the perpetrator is a stranger, deceased, or rebuilding risks more harm, you can choose release. Releasing a relationship requires ensuring you've sincerely forgiven before removing them from your life. Even a trace of hatred means it's not true release. They'll still occupy your thoughts and control your emotions. All right, I've now explained the four-step process of forgiving others in detail. Maybe you've already learned how to gradually release your hatred toward others. However, sometimes the situation reverses. You become the one hurting others, and that's normal. We all have moments of carelessness, selfishness, and cold-heartedness. If you've realized your mistakes now and are tormented by guilt and remorse, longing for forgiveness, all right, then live the coming days steadily and solidly. So perhaps you'd like to know how to ask others for forgiveness. Asking for forgiveness also has 4 steps: admitting fault, witnessing the pain, requesting forgiveness, and rebuilding or releasing the relationship. Now let's look at the specifics. The first step in asking for forgiveness is admitting fault. The key to admitting fault is to honestly face the truth and sincerely take responsibility for the harm done to the victim. And absolutely never make excuses for your actions. For example, saying, "I drank too much that day," or "I was so angry I lost control." Such words imply self-justification. Yes, perhaps your actions that day were indeed out of character, but you must still take responsibility for the harm caused. Only unwavering responsibility can warm the victim's frozen heart. If the victim was harmed but remains unaware, do you still need to admit fault? This divides into 2 scenarios. First, if admitting fault to them can rectify your mistake and help them live better, then you must speak up. For instance, suppose your competitor went bankrupt due to your behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Then admit your fault so they know it wasn't their lack of ability that caused the failure and made it to. The second scenario is when telling the truth would cause greater harm to the unaware victim. For example, if your close friend has no idea you had an emotional entanglement with his girlfriend, you can choose to confess to someone you trust or a counselor. The second step in asking for forgiveness is witnessing the pain. The best way is to listen to the victim as they tell their story and express how deeply they were hurt. Throughout this process, remain humble. No defending, no questioning. For instance, your ex-wife, whom you abused, cries and accuses you. "You ruined all these years for me."
At this moment, don't analyze why she suffered. That's not what she needs.
Additionally, if the victim questions you during this process, answer honestly and thoroughly without self-justification. Next, we enter the third step of asking forgiveness, making the request. First, understand that requesting forgiveness isn't about avoiding consequences. It's separate from taking responsibility. Requesting forgiveness also isn't just asking, "Can you forgive me?" It's far more than that. We must make every effort to repair the harm. How to repair it? That depends on the victim. What do they need? It might require returning stolen items, financial compensation, a concrete promise, etc. Crucially, once you promise, you must deliver. Otherwise, it causes secondary harm. What if they refuse your amends or won't forgive at all? Indeed, no one can guarantee forgiveness. But even if forgiven, you can still make reparations. For example, if you harmed your community, volunteer there to make amends. If your mistake caused someone's illness, support their family financially or practically. Then you can still enter the final step of seeking forgiveness. Rebuilding or releasing the relationship differs from when you're the forgiver. As the one seeking forgiveness, you have little control in this stage. You can certainly try to repair and rebuild, but if the victim chooses to release the relationship, respect their decision, truthfully, whether forgiven or not, whether the relationship is rebuilt or released, if you've sincerely completed these 4 steps, you'll grow from the mistake and unburden your heart. But there's a special case. Even after completing these steps, we might remain stuck because we can't forgive ourselves. Like Kate in the book, who accidentally killed elderly Margaret while driving at 17. Though Margaret's family forgave her immediately, she punished herself by rejecting their love. She struggled with guilt for 30 years, ultimately causing her own family to fall apart. We feel overwhelming guilt and refuse to forgive ourselves because we have a conscience. Yet it's precisely because we have a conscience that we must forgive ourselves. For only by making peace with ourselves can we make peace with others and the world. So how do we practice self-forgiveness? First, we need to let go of self-definitions and re-examine ourselves. While responsible for our actions, Defining ourselves solely by past mistakes denies our capacity for transformation. For example, if a man labels himself a violent jerk after one act of domestic abuse, he becomes trapped by that definition. Next time he acts similarly, he'll think, "This is just who I am." We must tear off negative labels and rediscover our goodness to help ourselves grow. Secondly, we must process our guilt. Guilt is part of conscience. When we betray a friend or yell at our child, guilt sparks self-reflection.
We can acknowledge guilt but shouldn't wallow in it. Wallowing shackles us to past mistakes and blocks growth.
The author believes the best way to dissolve guilt is through reparative actions. Do we need to confess our mistakes to the victim? Offer ongoing financial aid to those we've harmed? If unsure, consult a counselor or trusted friend. Finally, we must address our shame. Shame is that deep self-contempt, believing we're unworthy of forgiveness from others or ourselves. Long-suppressed shame can lead to depression, substance abuse, or even suicide. The best way to handle shame is sharing your ugly truth with those who've had similar experiences, like in support groups or related forums. This step is like courageously exposing your festering wound. Only then can true healing begin. With this, I've finished explaining this book. Truthfully, in this world, few have witnessed blood feuds or endured racial discrimination and brutality like Archbishop Tutu. Most of us bid is one of the most intense reservations. However, whether the matter of forgiveness is big or small, the principle remains the same. Forgiveness allows us to pardon soldiers who committed wartime atrocities, as well as the unfaithful lover who abandoned us. Forgiveness helps us understand that not every troubling action is deliberately targeted at us. Forgiveness lets us accept everyone, including our own human weaknesses, so we stop viewing the world through resentful eyes. Indeed, forgiveness isn't easy, but it truly brings peace to our hearts, our families, and even our world. Well, that concludes our discussion of forgiveness. Reading notes are below the audio. We'll see you next time, and